Greetings, respective viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So here I am on the North Main Street in Cork. Behind me you can see those two grey plaques up high. Well, this marks the house of Terence MacSwiney, who was Lord Mayor of Cork, and it's very well known that he killed himself in Brixton prison. He committed suicide by means of starvation in 1920. Now, his supporters prefer to say he died on hunger strike, which is another way of describing it, but he obviously certainly killed himself. So he was born in County Cork in 1879, not in the city, in the countryside, and moved in when he was little. So he was an academically able person, but he didn't pursue tertiary education. Very few people did in those days. So he dabbled at writing. He penned one play entitled The Revolutionist. We now say The Revolutionary, of course. And he joined the Irish Volunteers. He was married. He had one daughter. He was born in 1918. Anyway, so what's the next thing about him? Oh yes, so the Irish Volunteers split in September 1914 over John Redmond's Woodbridge speech. Should the Irish Volunteers join the British Army and fight the First World War, which had broken out, or should they not? So the Irish National Volunteers, there's about 90% of them, heeded Redmond's call. The other 10% just retained the name Irish Volunteers. Then the Easter Rising broke out, and they used the words Irish Republican Army. So Irish Volunteers increasingly called IRA, although the expression IRA had been around as long as the 1860s, as long ago as the 1860s, but only used in the United States. So anyway, MacSwiney was in charge of the Irish Volunteers here in Cork, and the Irish Volunteers Hall was around the corner on the Mardyke, although it was commonly called Broad Lane. And there were all these contradictory orders for manoeuvres on Easter Monday. Then they were cancelled, then they told something was happening. But of course, Roger Casement's arms shipment had come to grief. The man himself had been arrested. He tried to call it off. So MacSwiney, what was he to do? And hundreds of Irish volunteers had gathered, obviously having no idea that it was meant to be an insurrection, but actually to fight. And a lot of them had rifles because firearms law was very lax in those days. They'd been parading in uniform with their rifles, and the authorities had just let it go because, strictly speaking, drilling without the authorization of a magistrate was a crime, but they'd chosen to leave the law in abeyance. So the authorities certainly weren't heavy-handed. If anything, they were too lax. And it's not hard to understand why they said, well, we've got to be firm after this, because we were very lenient, completely reasonable and gentle, and they exploited our decency and mistook it for weakness. Anyhow, so what he did was he barricaded that Volunteers Hall and said, well, come on, we've got to fight, I've got to defend it. He was surrounded by the Crown forces. The Bishop of Cork, Dr. Daniel Coughlin, he interceded, he mediated between the British Army and the volunteers, and the volunteers surrendered without firing a shot. So an ignominious failure for Terence MacSwiney. Now, he could have fought if he wanted to fight. He could have had a guerrilla campaign or something like that, but to march up to the top of the hill and then surrender like that was surely catastrophic, as in him suffering 100% casualties without inflicting a single blow on the foe. The Kent family was different. The RIC, they knew that the Kent family, who lived just outside Cork, they were very much involved in the Republican movement. They were determined to overthrow the government by force. So the police went to surround their house, and firing broke out, blah, blah, blah. A head constable was shot dead. The Kents then surrendered. One of them tried to make a break for it. He was shot dead, trying to run away. And then one of them was sentenced to death for murder because he'd killed a police officer. Thomas Kent executed by firing squad at Victoria Barracks. That's now Collins Barracks up on Patrick's Hill. Anyway, so MacSwiney, he was in prison with the others, but he's set free because, again, the authorities were very, very humane, too humane, ridiculously humane. There was not one whit of gratitude on the behalf of the Republicans because the British authorities were incredibly merciful, and there was no recognition of that, no thankfulness for their compassion and for their extreme leniency. That was met with viciousness and cruelty by the Republicans. Anyway, so the conflict broke out anew in January 1919. He'd been elected to the Westminster Parliament, but of course, like all Sinn Féiners, they congregated at at a mansion house in Dublin, the Lord Mayor's house, and tried to call it Dáil Éireann. Well, actually, only a minority of them turned up. They weren't quorate, but they didn't care about even their own legal niceties. So a lady who was arrested for being in possession of documents likely to cause disaffection to His Majesty. The law was worded thus. And, he was high up in the IRA. Everybody knew that a conflict was going on. You think the authorities might say, well, we're going to kill you. We can execute by firing squad because of all these police officers and soldiers being killed. Now, if you didn't kill them by your own hand, you still ordered it to be done. So that is that. They're operating outside the Geneva Convention. They don't wear a uniform usually, and all the rest of it. They don't carry arms openly. So that's it. And almost anywhere else, that would have been done at the time. There are many irregular conflicts going on at the time in Poland, in Germany, in Russia, in Morocco, various places around the world. And the UK alone was so incredibly humane and law-abiding. I'm not saying the record of the Crown Forces was absolutely above reproach. Occasionally, they did disgraceful things. But overall, their record was very impressive and ethical. Anyway, I was sent to Brixton Prison in London. He decided he would kill himself by not taking food. He wanted to be released. Now, others than volunteers thought it was a mistake. There's no way that London was going to cave into such a demand. If they said sort of like political status or something like that, they might give it. That was too great a demand. Because if you cave in on that one, before you know it, every IRA man is on strike. Are you going to let them all go? No. Come on, about 20,000 of them were interned. But then he decided he wanted to die, and he said that my death will do more than my release to smash the British Empire. So he decided he would die, and also said it's he who can, not those who can inflict the most, but those who can suffer the most, who shall conquer. Anyway, so then he died in London in late 1920, and I suppose they should have buried his body there and denied the IRA propaganda coup. But again, the UK authorities were very decent, and they get no recognition for this whatsoever. His body was handed over to the Republican movement, who shipped it back to Ireland, and he had a funeral up there in the North Cathedral, and he's buried in St Finbarr's, right at the front, a very prominent grave. So his daughter lived on, and she died only a few years ago. Anyway, so that's Terence MacSwiney. He'd been elected Lord Mayor of Cork. His predecessor in that post, Thomas McCurtain, had been shot dead in his house in Blackpool by persons unknown, but people often blame the RIC. So that's that. There is Terence MacSwiney. There is a ballad about him, calling him a saint and a soldier. Well, he certainly hasn't been canonised.